The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty borderland between two properties that had been at odds for 3 generations. On one side stood the remnants of what had once been thriving Apache land, now reduced to a modest ranch struggling to survive against drought, poverty, and the weight of history. On the other side sprawled the expansive Carson Ranch, thousands of acres of prime cattle land that had grown prosperous over the decades, partly through legitimate hard work and partly through questionable land acquisitions that nobody talked about anymore. The fence between these two properties had become more than just a boundary marker. It had become a symbol of everything that divided two families, two cultures, and two very different ways of seeing the world. My name is James Carson, though everyone calls me Jim, and I'm the 4th generation of Carsons to work this land. I grew up hearing stories about the Apache family on the neighboring property, stories that painted them as difficult, unreasonable people who refused to sell their land despite generous offers and who caused problems at every opportunity. My grandfather and father had both tried to buy them out over the years, offering what they claimed were fair prices, but the Apache family had refused every time. By the time I inherited the ranch after my father's death, the relationship between our properties had deteriorated to the point where we barely acknowledged each other's existence, communicating only through lawyers when absolutely necessary. The current dispute centered around a quarter-mile stretch of fence that ran along a creek bed marking the boundary between our properties. The fence was old, installed decades ago by my grandfather, and had fallen into serious disrepair. Posts were rotting, wire was sagging, and in several places the fence had collapsed entirely. This wouldn't normally be a huge problem, except that the creek was one of the few reliable water sources in the area during dry seasons, and cattle from both properties naturally gravitated toward it. With the fence down, my cattle were crossing onto Apache land regularly, and it was causing tension that threatened to escalate into something more serious. I had received 2 certified letters from Ayanna Taza, the woman who now managed the Apache ranch after her father's death the previous year. The letters were formal and direct, stating that my cattle were trespassing on her land, damaging her limited grazing areas, and that I needed to repair the fence immediately or she would take legal action. I had ignored the first letter, frankly, because I was dealing with my own problems and didn't need another headache. The second letter was harder to ignore because it came with a deadline and a threat to impound any of my cattle found on her property, which would cost me thousands of dollars in fees and lost time. Rather than respond through lawyers, which would be expensive and time-consuming, I decided to drive over to the Apache ranch and talk to Ayanna directly. It was a Saturday morning in late September when I pulled up to her property in my truck. The ranch was smaller than I remembered from driving past it as a kid, and it showed signs of struggle. The barn needed paint, equipment looked old and worn, and the house itself, while clearly maintained with pride, was modest and weathered. I felt a pang of something, maybe guilt or sympathy, seeing the contrast between her operation and my own prosperous ranch. Ayanna was outside working on a water pump when I arrived, and she straightened up when she heard my truck. She was probably in her early 30s, with long dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing worn jeans and a faded work shirt. Her face was sun-bronzed and her hands showed the calluses of someone who did hard physical labor daily. When she recognized me, her expression didn't exactly warm up. She wiped her hands on her jeans and waited for me to approach, neither welcoming nor hostile, just watchful. I introduced myself, though she clearly knew who I was, and said I had come to talk about the fence situation. She nodded curtly and said we could talk, but her tone suggested she didn't expect the conversation to be productive. We stood there in the dusty yard, and I started explaining my perspective, that the fence was technically on the property line, which meant we shared responsibility for maintaining it, that I had been busy with my own ranch issues, and that I was willing to work something out that was fair to both of us. Ayanna listened without interrupting, but when I finished, her response was sharp and direct. She told me the fence had been installed by my grandfather on what was technically her family's side of the actual surveyed property line, meaning it was my fence on her land, and therefore entirely my responsibility to maintain. She said my cattle had been destroying her limited grazing land for months, that she had been patient and reasonable by sending formal notices instead of just impounding the animals immediately, and that she was tired of Carson men assuming they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. Her words stung because there was truth in them that I didn't want to acknowledge. I got defensive and said that my family had always tried to be good neighbors, that we had offered to buy her land multiple times at fair prices which would have solved all these problems, and that maybe if she wasn't so stubborn about holding onto a struggling ranch, we wouldn't be in this situation. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Her expression hardened, and I could see I had crossed a line. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I'll never forget. She told me that fence represented everything wrong between our families and our histories. She said her family had been on this land long before any Carsons arrived, that they had watched their territory shrink through broken treaties, legal manipulations, and pressure from people like my ancestors who saw Apache land as something to be taken rather than respected. She said the fence was a physical reminder that her people had been pushed into smaller and smaller spaces, and that every time a Carson offered to buy more of that space, it felt like another push toward disappearance. I stood there feeling the weight of history that I had never really considered before. I had grown up with a story that my family were pioneers who had built something from nothing through hard work and determination. I had never thought seriously about what was here before we arrived, or what had to be pushed aside for that building to happen. Ayana's words forced me to see the fence, the land, and our entire relationship through a completely different lens, and it was uncomfortable and humbling. I asked her what she wanted from me, expecting her to demand money or some kind of formal agreement that would protect her interests while still maintaining the adversarial relationship between our properties. What she said instead caught me completely off guard. She told me to do whatever I wanted with the fence. She said she was tired of fighting about it, tired of the cycle of conflict and resentment, and that if I wanted to repair it, move it, or tear it down completely, she didn't care anymore. She said she would deal with whatever I decided because that's what her family had always done. Adapted and survived despite whatever the Carsons or anyone else chose to do. The resignation in her voice was worse than anger would have been. She had essentially given up on the possibility that I would do the right thing, and she was emotionally removing herself from expecting anything different from me than what she had gotten from generations of my family. She turned to go back to her work on the water pump, dismissing me, and I stood there feeling like the biggest jerk in Arizona. I drove home thinking about that conversation for hours. That night, I pulled out old property surveys, deed records, and historical documents about the ranch that I had inherited along with the land. I had never looked at them closely before, just filed them away as boring paperwork. But now I read through them carefully, and what I found made me sick to my stomach. Ayana was right about the fence. It had been placed deliberately several feet onto what was legally her family's land, a small encroachment that over decades had allowed my family to use resources that weren't technically ours. More disturbing were notes and letters I found from my grandfather documenting his attempts to buy Apache land, including strategies for making life difficult for them in hopes they would sell. There were records of water rights disputes where my grandfather had used legal tactics and political connections to limit their access to creek water. There was correspondence with other local ranchers about coordinating to pressure Apache families to sell and leave the area. This wasn't the heroic pioneer story I had grown up believing. This was a documented pattern of using power, resources, and systemic advantages to push people off their ancestral land. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about Ayana's face when she told me to do whatever I wanted with the fence, the exhaustion and resignation in her voice. I thought about her working alone on that struggling ranch, maintaining her family's presence on land that had been theirs long before it was ever divided up by property lines and fences. I thought about my own comfortable position and how much of it was built on exactly the kind of injustices she had described. The next morning, I started making phone calls. I contacted a surveyor and had them come out to do a precise survey of the property line using modern GPS technology and the original deed descriptions. The survey confirmed what I had found in the documents. The fence was indeed on Ayana's side of the actual property line, and it had been giving my family access to land and water that legally belonged to her family. I then called a fencing contractor and got quotes for not just repairing the old fence, but installing a completely new one with proper materials that would last for decades. But I didn't stop there. I realized that simply fixing the fence wasn't enough to address the real issues between our properties. I needed to do something unexpected, something that would actually begin to repair the damage that generations of my family had caused. I started researching water rights and found that there were legal mechanisms for sharing creek water in ways that would benefit both properties. I consulted with an agricultural expert about grazing patterns and realized there were ways we could coordinate our cattle management that would actually improve outcomes for both ranches. 2 weeks later, I drove back to Ayana's ranch, this time with a folder full of documents, surveys, and proposals. She saw me pull up and her expression was guarded, probably expecting another argument or some kind of legal maneuvering. I asked if we could sit down and talk, and after a moment's hesitation, she agreed. We sat at a weathered picnic table in her yard, and I started explaining what I had done and what I had learned. I showed her the survey proving she was right about the fence placement. I apologized directly for my family's history of encroachment and pressure tactics, acknowledging that I couldn't change the past but I could choose to do things differently going forward. I presented a proposal for installing a new fence at the correct property line, entirely at my expense, using high-quality materials. But more than that, I proposed a water-sharing agreement that would guarantee her ranch access to the creek regardless of drought conditions, and a grazing coordination plan where we would work together to manage our cattle in ways that would benefit both properties. Ayana listened to all of this with an expression I couldn't quite read. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she asked me why I was doing this, what I was really after, because in her experience Carson men didn't do anything without expecting something in return. I told her honestly that I was doing it because it was the right thing to do, because I was ashamed of what I had learned about my family's history, and because I wanted to break the cycle of conflict and injustice that had defined the relationship between our properties for too long. She studied my face for what felt like forever, and then something shifted in her expression. She said she had expected me to either ignore her complaints entirely or do the absolute minimum required by law. She had never imagined a Carson would voluntarily give up advantages or acknowledge historical wrongs. She asked if I was serious about the water-sharing agreement because access to reliable water during droughts was the difference between her ranch surviving or failing. I assured her I was completely serious and had already had my lawyer draft formal agreements that would be legally binding regardless of who owned either property in the future. Over the next 3 months, I hired contractors to install a brand new fence at the correct property line, which actually gave Ayana back several acres of land her family had legally owned but hadn't had practical access to for decades. We formalized the water-sharing agreement and the grazing coordination plan. I also discovered that there was a small parcel of land that my grandfather had acquired from her grandfather in the 1960s through what the document suggested was significant pressure and an unfairly low price. I worked with my lawyer to research whether there was any way to address that historical wrong, and we found a legal mechanism to transfer it back to her family. When I told Ayana I wanted to deed that parcel back to her, she actually cried. She told me that land had been where her great-grandmother's house had stood, and losing it had been devastating to her family. Having it returned was something she had never imagined possible. She asked me again why I was doing all of this, and I told her that I couldn't be proud of what my family had built if it was built on taking from others and refusing to acknowledge those wrongs. I told her I wanted my legacy to be different from my grandfather's, and that meant making things right where I could. The changes weren't just symbolic. The new fence and water agreements genuinely improved both of our operations. By coordinating our grazing, we both saw improvements in land quality and cattle health. By working together instead of in opposition, we were able to share equipment and knowledge that benefited both ranches. What had been a relationship defined by conflict and resentment gradually transformed into something that resembled actual neighborly cooperation. About 6 months after that first conversation where Ayana had told me to do whatever I wanted with the fence, we were both working on opposite sides of the new fence line, repairing a section where a fallen tree had damaged some posts. We worked together to clear the tree and fix the fence, and when we were done, we stood there on either side of the property line, and she smiled at me for the first time. She said she had expected the worst from me that day when I first showed up, that she had given me permission to do whatever I wanted because she assumed I would do what was easiest and most advantageous for myself, just like every other Carson before me. She said I had done something unexpected by choosing to do what was right instead of what was easiest. She thanked me for seeing her and her family as people deserving of respect and justice, rather than as obstacles to be removed or ignored. That moment, standing on either side of that fence that now represented something different than it had before, felt more significant than any business deal or legal agreement. It felt like a genuine breaking of an old, destructive pattern and the beginning of something better. The relationship between our ranches continued to improve over the following years. We became genuine friends, sharing meals, helping each other during difficult seasons, and working together on regional ranching initiatives. Other ranchers in the area noticed the change, and some followed our example in addressing their own boundary and historical issues with neighboring properties. The fence between our lands was still there, marking the legal property line, but it no longer symbolized division and injustice. Instead, it represented the choice to respect boundaries while still building connection and cooperation. Looking back on that day when Ayana told me to do whatever I wanted with the fence, I'm grateful that her challenge prompted me to examine what I really wanted to be as a person and as a steward of the land I had inherited. She expected me to take the easy path of self-interest like my ancestors had done. Instead, I chose to acknowledge historical wrongs, make genuine restitution where possible, and build a relationship based on mutual respect and fairness. That choice didn't just change a fence line. It changed the trajectory of both our ranches and both our lives. Sometimes the most unexpected thing we can do is simply choose to do what's right, even when no one expects it from us.